right, welcome to Unit 6, Lecture 1. This is over the lymphatic system. Underneath lymphatics, you can see some available resources for this lecture here. So in your textbook, you can read Chapter 20, the lymphatic system and immunity, just Module 20.1. So 20.1 is our main module that we'll be looking at. From your workbook, you can go to Chapter 20, pages 392, 393, and 394. Great places for labeling and answering some questions. So here is our task list for Unit 6, Lecture 1. Of course, we're going to take some notes over it. There is the Unit 6 homework assignment, Module 17. There is the tracing lymph flow through the body activity that you can complete as well to help you understand. And then there is the Unit 6 Quiz 1. So we're taking a look at the lymphatic system here. You can see down to the right that there's a little description of the lymphatic system. So I'm going to give you a chance to go ahead and read that. All right, so if you took a look at that down there and you read the description, you take a look at the picture on top of that description, we can see that there are some associated structures that the lymphatic system has. So some of the structures associated with the lymphatic system are things like our red bone marrow here, our thymus, we have lymphatic vessels. The thoracic duct is actually a lymphatic vessel. We have the spleen. We have lymph nodes. So we have quite a few structures. These aren't the only structures that are associated with the lymphatic system, but there's quite a few of them. So the red bone marrow, the thymus, lymphatic vessels, the spleen, and the lymph nodes. After you read the description of the lymphatic system, we can see what body response is actually very closely associated with the lymphatic system, and that is going to be our immune response. So our immune response is very closely associated with our lymphatic system. It's actually very cool how they interact with each other, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. So there's a tissue way back in Unit 1 that the spleen and other lymphatic tissues were made of. If you remember the slide, it had burnt popcorn on it, and it had this tissue here. Also, we get some hints as to what kind of tissue it is, here and here. So what kind of tissue are our spleen and other lymphatic tissues made of? Yeah, reticular, right? It says it right there, right where I underlined it. So this is reticular tissue. If you remember all the way back in Unit 1, it was either loose or dense connective tissue. What kind was it? Yeah, this was loose connective tissue. So, just trying to keep things in your brain, keep you focusing on what you need to know. So the lymphatic system is made up of 3 general parts. These parts obviously get broken down into more parts, but this is our 3 general parts. We have 3 choices: lymph, lymphatic vessels, and lymph tissues and organs, and we have A, B, and C. So what do you think lymph is? Yep. Lymph is the fluid found in lymph vessels. Okay, so lymph is just the fluid we find in lymph vessels. What are lymphatic vessels? I know this one was a really hard one. So lymphatic vessels are vessels that carry lymph. Okay, so vessels that carry lymph around, which makes our lymph tissues and organs, items such as our lymph nodes, the spleen, and the thymus, among others. All right, so back to recalling. So this is from last unit here, the last chapter. Remember that blood capillaries function to allow materials to pass from our blood vessels to the tissues and vice versa. So from the tissues to the blood vessels. What are some of those materials that can pass from blood vessels to tissues? So if you remember some of them, we have things like oxygen, We have carbon dioxide, we have sugars, we have garbage, right? All that trash that we make on the inside of our bodies. Another big one is water. And another one that we can pass that we don't often think about is actually germs. Okay, so when I say germs, I mean things that are going to be attacking our bodies, such as bacteria or viruses. So we can pass a lot of things through our blood vessel tissues, right? So there are things that we're going to need to take a look at before they actually enter our body. Looking at the picture to the right here, we can see A and B labeled. We see that there are these things called lymphatic capillaries and things called blood capillaries. We've talked about blood capillaries in the past. So recalling what you would find in between these, we have A and we have B. So remember, we're in a small location. A is blue, so that represents something that is deoxygenated. So what does A represent? That's representing a venule, right? A tiny vein. That's what comes after a capillary, right? So capillary venule. So what does B represent? Yeah, B represents an arteriole, a tiny artery. So, right, so those are things that we recall from last chapter. So remember, we have many items that are being passed between blood vessels, which are the capillaries and the tissues, right? We have those things like oxygen, carbon dioxide, sugar, water, all that fun stuff, along with things like germs and waste. So we have quite a few things that are being passed. Do you think that every bit of what gets passed between the blood vessels and tissues gets absorbed? No, absolutely not. All right, so not every bit of what's passed between blood vessels and tissues gets absorbed. And why that's important, we'll find out here pretty soon. Again, looking at the same picture, we have our lymphatic capillaries and our blood capillaries. Does the lymphatic system interact with the blood vessels of the body? Yeah, we can see that here, right? So if you look at the blood capillaries, which are those blue and red portions, you can see that the lymph capillaries are intertwined in between those blood vessels. So our lymphatic capillaries and our blood capillaries are intertwined. So we can see that, which kind of makes this next question kind of easy for you. What part of our lymphatic system directly interacts with the blood vessels of the body? Yeah, the lymphatic capillaries. So lymphatic capillaries are going to directly interact with our blood vessels. So what the lymphatic capillaries do is they take in any excess fluid that is not absorbed by our blood capillaries or tissues. So remember last slide, we said that we're not going to actually take up every single thing that's passed back and forth. Our lymphatic capillaries are going to take up any excess fluid that our tissues or our capillaries do not actually take up. So the lymphatic capillaries take the leftovers. Okay, so leftovers and lymphatic capillaries. So taking a look at the picture to the right here, we can kind of see what the function of the lymphatic system is. So the function of the lymphatic system is to bring excess fluid back to some organ. So go ahead and take a look at the picture and figure out, where are we sending lymph to? So if you take a look here, this is a spot where we are going to gather up excess fluid. So we have excess fluid getting gathered up by our lymphatic structures. And the arrows here, here, and here are all pointing back to the heart. So we are bringing excess fluid back to the heart. So lymph tissue, or not lymph tissue, just lymph. So lymph only travels one direction. What way does lymph actually travel? Yeah, it's going to travel toward the heart. Okay, so that's it. Lymph doesn't travel away from the heart, it only travels towards it. So the important thing to realize about this is we say lymph only travels one way. It only travels towards the heart. Um, is it still considered lymph once it gets into the chambers of the heart? No, it's not. Now it's part of the blood. So once lymph gets into the chambers of the heart, it's going to mix with the blood, and now it's just a part of the blood. You have to keep that in mind because lymph is only called lymph when it's in the lymphatic capillaries. Once lymph is outside of those capillaries, it's no longer considered that. Okay, so once lymph gets out, once it's in the chambers of the heart, it is now a part of the blood. So looking at the structures that lymph has to go through in order to get through the heart, we're going to start here with our lymphatic capillaries, or our lymph capillaries. We have our lymph capillaries. Go ahead and list out what it has to go through in order to get to the heart. All right. So hopefully all you did was follow that along. Oh, that was a nice line. Let me erase that. Hopefully you just followed along. So we start with our lymph capillaries. We're then going to go to our lymph collecting vessels. Then we have things called lymph trunks. And then we have things called lymph ducts, which are going to lead into the veins, which will go into the heart. Okay, so we have lymph capillaries to lymph collecting vessels to lymph trunks to lymph ducts to the veins to the heart. I don't have a mnemonic to help you with this, which is why I ask you to hopefully, figure something out. But just from the capillaries to the collecting vessels to the trunks to the ducts to the veins to the heart. So just a little way that lymph is actually going to travel. All right, so now we're going to take a look at a couple of the major blood vessels that are going to be involved with our lymphatic system. You can see there's an A, a B, a C, and a D here to kind of help place where you are. I'm going to draw this little area. So here, about from here to here, that is going to be where your heart typically is. So I'll put a H, a very well drawn H here. So it's where your heart typically is. And then down here are just like the general organs. So general abdominal organs. So we'll go with an AO here. How about abdominal organs? There we go. Beautiful. So just to kind of help place where you are, maybe that'll help connect the dots with some of these blood vessels. So looking at A and recalling from last unit, what is A? Yeah, A is our right subclavian vein, right? The vein that runs right underneath our clavicle on the right side. So that's A. What is B? You can see that it's connected to the top portion of your heart. Because of that, we know that B is going to be our superior vena cava. What is C? Yeah, C is inferior, so it's actually going to be our inferior vena cava, which leaves our left subclavian vein for D. So that's where we're at. Hopefully you remember that from last unit here. So notice that the lymphatic vessels, which are in green, you can see them in green there, they lead to these major veins. They lead to things like your inferior vena cava, your left subclavian vein, your right subclavian vein, and your superior vena cava. So why would the lymphatic vessels pour into these veins? It's because they're major blood vessels that lead to the heart. Remember that lymph goes to the heart. The only way to get to the heart is going to be through veins. Now, just a disclaimer, these aren't the only veins that are involved, but these are our major blood vessels that are going to go ahead and lead to the heart. So continuing to look at that same diagram here, remembering that we have the heart in the middle and the abdominal organs just inferior to that. We do have two major lymph ducts. So we have two major lymph ducts, not like the quack quack ducks, but like the ducts. The ducts. So we have two major ones here. What are the names of these two major ducts? Yeah, we have our right lymphatic duct and our thoracic duct. So we have two ducts that are our major ones that are going to be returning lymph back towards the heart. Looking down here, we have this thing called the cisterna chyli, which is actually how you pronounce that one. So cisterna chyli. Notice that it's connected to a certain duct. What duct is a cisterna chyli connected to? Yeah, it's connected to the thoracic duct, so you can see that that is connected there. Your cisterna chyli, it's going to receive lymph from the lower parts of your body because it's in the lower region. It's especially going to get fats from the small intestine. If you see where that cisterna chyli is located, it's located down in your lower abdomen region, which is where your small intestine is. So it's going to take in fats from the small intestine and flow into the thoracic duct. Essentially what cisterna chyli means is box of juice. So what I imagine is that someone at some point found a cisterna chyli in somebody that they were either doing surgery on or maybe a cadaver, and they like squeezed it and it like squirted like a little box of juice. But it's really like a little box of fat. That's essentially what the cisterna chyli is doing. So it's taking in fats from the small intestine and giving it to your thoracic duct. Looking at this diagram, we can see that one side of our body is clearly working harder than the other. Which duct will drain more lymph, our right lymphatic duct or our thoracic duct? It's going to be our thoracic duct. Now remember that your right lymphatic duct is going to be over here, and your left your thoracic duct is not your left lymphatic duct, it's your thoracic duct is going to be down in this general region. But your thoracic duct does a lot more work than your right lymphatic duct, like a ton more. You can remember this because it's in the same way in the heart. Your right side of your heart doesn't work as hard as the left side of your heart. Looking at this picture here, you can also kind of see what our right lymphatic duct drains versus what our left lymphatic duct drains. So you want to also keep that in mind. So you can see your right drainage area includes your right arm and just a very small part of your thoracic region and also the right side of your head. Everything else your thoracic duct does. So if I ever ask you about the legs are the thoracic duct. The thoracic duct takes care of the legs. So please keep that in mind whenever I ask you about the draining and who drains what. All right, so now we're going to look at some lymph tissues and organs themselves. I have a list of some choices here: the appendix, bone marrow, Peyer's patches, spleen, thymus, and tonsils. Hopefully when you look at that picture there, you can kind of determine which tissue and which organ we are looking at. So let's go ahead and try A there. Which one would A be? Well, it's part of the bone, so it's going to be the bone marrow. What about B? Yeah, B you might not have heard of quite yet. B is going to be our Peyer's patches. What about C? Yeah, they're up where your tonsils are, so C is going to be your tonsils. What about D? D is your thymus, so that's just another lymph organ that we have. What about E? Good. E is going to be the spleen, which leaves F to be the appendix. So your appendix is lymph tissue. It does have a little bit of a job to do in the body, despite what you might have heard. So all lymph tissue and organs, except for your thymus and the bone marrow, are going to be responsible for filtering lymph and alerting the immune system to potential threats. We'll talk about what the thymus and what the bone marrow do in just a little bit. All right, so instant review, gotta instantly review things. What does structure A represent? Yep, that's our bone marrow. And what does D represent? Yeah, that's going to be our thymus. We just talked about that. So we have bone marrow for A. D is our thymus. Both the bone marrow and the thymus help to mature specific types of white blood cells or leukocytes. So they're there to help mature them. Specifically, they're going to help mature these kinds of white blood cells. So what kind of white blood cell is that picture showing us? That is a lymphocyte, right? With those big spherical nuclei, and they're generally smaller white blood cells with big nuclei. So they're going to help mature lymphocytes. So looking at the names, we have B lymphocytes and we have T lymphocytes. What types of WBCs, what types of white blood cells mature in the bone marrow? All right, I made a big deal about the B in bone marrow, right? Because bone marrow is going to mature our B lymphocytes, all right? Bone with B. B lymphocytes are going to mature in our bone marrow, which leaves another type of white blood cell to mature in the thymus. And again, I made a big deal about the T here. So what do you think, or what types of white blood cells will mature in the thymus? Yeah, that's going to be our T lymphocytes. So that's kind of nice, right? Bone marrow and our B lymphocytes and our thymus with our T lymphocytes. Now we're taking a look at the spleen. Okay, so the spleen is here. Down in this little green box here to the bottom left, you see that the spleen destroys bad red blood cells. It also alerts the immune system to potential threats, so that's kind of the spleen's job. Looking at the figure here, what kind of pulp do we find in the spleen? We can see that here we have both red and white pulp in our spleen. So we have both red and white pulp. What kind of pulp would destroy red blood cells? Yeah, when I said red, it's not a coincidence, right? Or it is. No, it's not a coincidence. I said red. If it's going to destroy red blood cells, it's actually going to be red pulp. That's actually the reason why it's red, is it's destroying these red blood cells and it's getting like tinted that color. So red blood cells are getting destroyed by the red pulp. Now, this is a good thing. You don't want blood cells roaming around that aren't good. So your spleen is just going to take care of any of those red blood cells that are tired or not formed correctly. So if red pulp is destroying red blood cells, what kind of pulp would alert our immune system? Yeah, that's going to be our white pulp. So you can kind of use this to help you remember this. White blood cells are going to be part of your immune system, right? Leukocytes and immune system. And white pulp is going to make sure that you are alerting the immune system with the spleen. We also have these things called MALT tissues here. MALT stands for mucosa-associated lymphatic tissues. So remember, mucosa is, we're talking about a mucous membrane. Mucous membranes are kind of just where we have mucus secreting cells. So think back, what type of cells secrete mucus? If you remembered goblet cells, I'm very excited. So remember, goblet cells secrete gobs of mucus. We find these throughout our body, but we specifically have them in places like our intestines. Also thinking about mucosa and mucus, hopefully it makes you think of places where things can enter our body. Lymphatic structures that are a part of MALT, we have our tonsils, our pyre patches, and our appendix. So your tonsils right near your mouth, right? So your mouth is going to contain quite a few tonsils, that general region. Pyre patches, which are hanging out in your small intestine, and your appendix, which is in your large intestine. So looking at one of the malts is the tonsils here. So looking at the body, looking at the regions here, in what regions of the body do we find our tonsils? We find them in one general area, but we like to kind of split it up into two. We find them in the back of the nose and in the throat. So pharyngeal means throat, if you remember that from, like the glossal pharyngeal nerve, right? So pharyngeal, we're talking about the throat. Palatine tonsil, that's talking about your palate. So if you look here at your soft palate, you find your palatine tonsil. And lingual tonsil, lingual means tongue, so you find one on your tongue. So the three kinds of tonsils that we have our pharyngeal, our palatine, and our lingual. You want to make sure you know where those are located. So your pharyngeal, we're talking about like the back of your throat/nose. So you can see your pharyngeal tonsil. Your palatine is hanging off of this thing called your soft palate, and your lingual tonsil should make you think of your tongue. Those are the tonsils that you find on the back of your tongue. Now, I don't know if I said the way to remember your MALT tissues. Remember, your MALT tissues are the tonsils, pyre patches, and your appendix. So I always remember it by saying that I have a MALT on tap, right? So MALT on tap, we have our tonsils, our appendix, and our pyre patches. That's how I remember that. So hopefully that'll help you remember it. So looking at this figure here to the left, this is a section of a tonsil, which means they took a tonsil and they just cut out a very small portion of it and looked at it underneath a microscope. And we can see that our tonsils have a special adaptation. What special adaptation do tonsils have? Yeah, they have these things called tonsillar crypts. So they have these things called tonsillar crypts. And I think that tonsillar crypts are probably the funniest thing that we have. They're just really cool and they really help out our immune system here. So essentially what tonsillar crypts are going to do is they're going to lure um, they're going to lure bacteria and viruses or foreign objects into the body so that we can attack it. Okay, so basically, it's a trap. Okay, so it's a trap. What they're going to do, it's going to trick those pathogens into these small spaces so that our body can attack those pathogens. Essentially, it's a trap. It's like, oh, yes, here's a free entrance into the body. Come on down. And the pathogen will slowly make its way down, and then it'll get trapped, and then our immune system can go ahead and attack it. Now, if any of you have ever had tonsillitis, you know that this doesn't always work, right? It doesn't always work. Sometimes the bacteria or the virus or the pathogen can get in there and then they'll just take over. But most of the time, these tonsillar crypts are super helpful. They're just going to lure things down and attack them. So, yeah, I don't know how else to describe them except that they are a trap. So we have some major lymph node locations here. Again, I told you at the beginning, learning certain things right away will help you out so much in the last part of the semester. So we have A, B, C, and D. I have some choices over for you to the left. What is A? Yeah, A is going to be our cervical lymph node because it's up in the cervical region of our body, up in that neck region. What's B? B is our axillary location underneath our armpit, so we have a major lymph node there. What about C? Remember we talked about mesenteric, those inferior and superior mesenteric veins and arteries. So that is in the general region of C, which leaves inguinal for D. So all of these terms you've seen before. This is a case of don't memorize something you already know. This is also a reason for you to, oh boy, let me restart that sentence. Hopefully this helps you out too when we talk about major lymph node locations, because your doctor, if you are coming in for like a cold or something like that, they will feel your lymph nodes, and they don't just feel like your cervical lymph nodes. A lot of people, when you get a cold, you feel your cervical lymph nodes and you're like, oh my gosh, my lymph nodes are so swollen. Your doctor will also check under your arm and feel there for lymph nodes, and also your abdomen. Typically, they don't check out the inguinal area unless it has something to do, if it's more of a infection closer to the inguinal area, but your docs will check out your cervical, your axillary, and your mesenteric. That's why they're touching all those parts of your body. What are the function of lymph nodes? It's the same function as everything else. They're going to filter lymph. They're going to alert the immune system to potential threats. So just the same thing. Lymph in general, our lymphatic system, we're talking about filtering out lymph. We're talking about alerting the immune system to potential threats. All right, so the figure to the right is a lymph node. It's not a kidney, all right? It's a lymph node. We can see that we have vessels that enter a lymph node and vessels that leave a lymph node. So what do we call the vessels that enter a lymph node? So if you look here, we have arrows pointing inward, which means that our fluid is going inward. Those are going to be our afferent vessels. And what do we call the vessels that leave a lymph node? Yeah, those are right here, these arrows. Notice how they are leaving the lymph node. Those are efferent vessels. So I always like to say that afferents arrive and efferent exit. So if you can remember afferent arrive and efferent exit, hopefully that helps you remember which ones are coming and which ones are going. Afferent and efferent are very consistent throughout your body. So if you can remember it now, it'll help you later on with other vessels that are going to and from organs. Looking at this picture here, what do we have more of? Do we have more afferent or efferent vessels? Now we have more afferent vessels. So you can see here that we have more afferent that are coming in. Now, what would happen to the flow of lymph because of this? Yeah, while in the lymph node, our lymph is going to slow way down. So it's going to slow way down. And Nicolas Cage over here is telling it to slow the yellow box down. It's going to slow down. We really want to slow down our lymph. And this is a good thing. So the reason why it's a good thing to slow down our lymph, or as Nick Cage there, slow the yellow box down, it's a good thing because it's going to allow us more time to check the lymph out. So what it's going to do, it's basically going from like a 4 lane highway down to 1 lane. If you guys have ever, traveled, towards Chicago or Indianapolis or any place in Michigan, I can't think of a name. You have gone through the whole like going down to 1 lane thing. Everything slows down, and what ends up happening because of that is each car goes through one little section at one little time. That is exactly what's happening to our lymph. It's going from a huge amount of lanes down to a very few lanes so that each part can get checked out. We want to make sure that we're checking out our lymph so that we have every opportunity to take care of a pathogen before it actually reaches the entire body. So if the excess fluid leaked out from capillaries, from our blood capillaries and our tissues, wasn't picked up by our lymphatic capillaries, the fluid would sit in our tissues and it would cause edema. So edema is essentially swelling. So you can see in these photos here that the left leg of this person is swollen and the right arm of this person is also swollen. We're going to call that edema. So edema is going to be the swelling of our tissues because of excess fluid. Edema can also happen because of surgery and the removal of lymph nodes. And the reason why that this happens is lymph can't drain as well. And when lymph can't drain as well, we're going to get a buildup of it. You see this happen with surgeries quite often. It's just you've taken away the ability of your lymphatic system to drain, and it just causes a buildup. Now, typically you can get rid of the lymph by like massaging the tissues and things like that, and sometimes you have to insert drainage into your into like your arms or something like that in order to get rid of that excess fluid. All right, we made it through this lecture here. The homework that we have is the Unit 6 homework assignment, so Module 17. That to help you understand activity is tracing the flow of lymph through the body activity, and then the related quiz is the Unit 6 quiz 1.